Well, folks, the doors are open. HMRC has opened up their portal. Letters are being sent out to the millions of self-employed people in the United Kingdom. It's grant number 5 on the table. In tonight's broadcast, I'm going to talk you through more so the changes on grant number 5, and we've got something introduced called the turnover test. Now, what's that all about? Well, I'm going to talk that through. I've even got some numbers. I've got a few slides to share with you, a few forms that you need to get your head around. And if you're in the lane for it, if you're eligible, then make sure you get that claim. We'll talk dates, we'll talk money. If you've got questions that you want to fire at me, put them into the chat box and the like. Why don't we just have a little bit of intro music and then we'll crack. And what a smooth transition back from the music back into the room. So hi folks, my name is Vermoon. I'm an accountant for over 26 years. I deal with a whole variety of businesses from the self-employed up to social enterprise and companies. Tonight my focus is on the self-employed grant number 5. If you've liked what you hear in the show, which I hope you do, then I'd love it if you give a thumbs up, give it a share some comments. Things that I'm going to refer to, by the way, in terms of news articles, information. You've got loads of ways to tap into some free resources here. You can, let's run them through. You can go onto my fledgling but growing, not quite rivaling Netflix I Hate Numbers YouTube channel. You can check out the website for some weekly blogs, news information, covering a whole range of issues for businesses and those people involving themselves in the world of entrepreneurship. And you're sitting at home thinking, great, let's crack on with the show. Now, as we go through, as I do these live broadcasts, I always love to answer questions. So if you've got a question that crops up, put it into the comments box accordingly. So whether you're listening on LinkedIn, whether you're listening on Facebook or YouTube, welcome. Thank you very much for giving up some of your wonderful evening. If you are coming up on replay, I believe you've got to do things like hashtag replay. I know you're there. You can keep me company for tonight. I will pick up the comments after the broadcast is finished, but I'm here to help you in a no-nonsense, jargon-free, and again, you've got questions cropping up, then feel free to share them. So what are we going to look at tonight? So by the power of magic, let's just go through what the main agenda items are. The resources that I'm going to pin out tonight, by the way, so I'm going to do a number illustrator to demonstrate this thing called the turnover test. I'm more than happy if you guys and folks want to grab hold of a copy. I'll make an announcement towards the end of the broadcast, and I'm more than happy to share that with you. Now we're going to give it an overview, and I think because of time and we're coming up to grant number 5, I want to just go through mostly what the changes are. I also want to share some news relatively hot off the premises, what our friends HMRC are up to, what you need to be careful of. And for those of you who've been submitting tax returns already, by the way, there may be an obstacle being thrown up by HMRC, which I'll discuss as the broadcast unfolds. Again, I'm going to focus on the changes, and without giving anything away at this moment, the key changes are a turnover test. You've got to do those number crunching here, and that determines the level of grant that's coming in. Everything else is as before. So for this one, I would say the 5th grant is probably the more testing, so to speak, the more challenging, because as well as having to comply with the normal conditions, which I'll run through in a few moments, there's an additional test that comes into it, which fundamentally determines the level of grant that you will receive. So this works. We're going to talk money. We can't talk self-employed grant without discussing what's it actually worth, how much money are we talking about, and the dates that you really need to pay attention to. Remember, this, as far as we're aware, is the 5th grant and final grant. There's nothing to indicate on the landscape that the government are going to roll out a grant number 6. So at this moment in time, this is the last piece of money in terms of grant that's going to be provided to the self-employed. So you've got time windows to adhere to, otherwise you will lose out on the opportunity. And lastly, there's a couple of extra bits good to know in terms of follow-up. Now, I believe also, excuse my, by the way, little hesitancy, amateurish behaviour. I had a flood in my office over the weekend, so it was resembling something like out of Noah's Ark. So I'm working away on Sunday, the day of the football, as one does, and I'm hearing this hissing sound and a burst water pipe, brilliantly handled and dealt with, but at the time, its galoshes on. The animals coming in 2 by 2, so therefore the whole week's been slightly disorientated with dealing with that. I just thought I'd share that with you. So let's just get some ticker tape on here. So those are things that we're going to cover tonight. That's as good as an aid memoir. Just a couple of links there for you to look at. So if you do need to get in touch, if you do want to grab some more information, 2 good resources. One is an email. If you want to be added to our newsletter, our family, even if you're not a client, then we're happy to share weekly updates with you, and obviously updates coming on the site. So let's crack on. This. I'm standing here thinking this is going to come in. Let's just use that. Good old-fashioned mouses. Right, so what's the main headlines, folks, before we dive into the numbers? So first of all, what stays the same? Previous eligibility rules still apply. I'm just going to quickly overview those, and by all means, check out the website. If you check out the I Hate Numbers YouTube channel, there are a couple of videos there. One recently done a few weeks ago on the 5th grant and on previous grants. But previous eligibility, let's summarize this again. It's you've got to be self-employed, and that's somebody who completes a section in your personal tax return, typically with the orange pages, that describes you as self-employed. Don't get sucked into this idea. In normal English and speak, when we talk about self-employed, we normally talk about people who work for themselves. In this context, it's effectively sole traders, individual who are running a business. So landlords, unfortunately, you don't come into this remit here. It's about a trading activity. In addition, in certainly grant number 4, those people who registered for self-employment in the 2019-20 tax year, and in proper English, that means if you registered for self-employment between the 6th of April 19 and 5th of April 20, grant number 4 meant that you could come in, you could join in, you could get some grant if you meet all the other criteria. Other things, your business has got to have been affected, they use that word significantly, by coronavirus, predominantly between the dates 1st of May 21 and the end of September 21. So there's going to be a bit of educated guesswork here, because if you submit your grant application in before the end of September, you're going to have to take a view on where you think you will be by the end of September. And again, a couple of tips to share with you when it comes to making that judgment call. Other things as well, there's the level of profitability. So if you've hit over 50K, then it's unlikely you're going to be eligible to make a claim. You can't have more than 50% or less than 50% of your income coming from self-employment. So if you've got a landlord who's got a rental property, pension income, all the rest of it, look at the overall basket, and that comes into play. You can still claim for grant number 5, by the way, even if you haven't claimed for the previous 4 grants. You won't be able to retrospectively claim for grants 1 to 4. That window has gone, that door has closed. But if for whatever reason you haven't claimed for the previous grants, and I am aware of people who haven't done that, you can still claim for grant number 5 if you have met the eligibility conditions. And as I said, you've got to be self-employed, which means individual effectively, filling in the orange boxes, or a partner in a partnership. Got to have completed an 18-19 tax return. That will be a reference point for you later on. You've traded or trading in 1920, and you've got to have submitted that tax return by the 2nd of March 2021. And the key thing is that was introduced around about grant number 4, is that demand has impacted on your business. In English, that means you're selling less, you've got less customers, you've got less money coming in. We're not talking about the cost necessarily, and the reduced demand. And remember, it's got to be linked to coronavirus. So if your business has just hit a brick wall, and it would have hit a brick wall irrespective of coronavirus affecting it, then you won't be able to make the claim, or you certainly shouldn't be making the claim. So there's got to be a coronavirus correlation between what's going on in your business and you submitting a claim. Now, the key changes are as follows. There is a turnover test introduced. So in the vast majority of cases, pretty much all of it, HMRC will contact you as the taxpayer to say, okay, we've looked at the numbers, we've got those figures, and we think you're eligible to make the claim. So here's some details, crack on and make the application. Once you've gone through that, you will then have to make a declaration. You've got some number crunching to do, and you have to satisfy a turnover test that says if your turnover is dropped by a certain level, then you will get a certain level of grant. And you've got to, in the vast majority of cases, compare what your turnover is for 2021 against a reference year, either taking 1920 or you look at 2018, 2019. So in the vast majority of cases, there are some exceptions, or there's one major exception. You look at your turnover for 2021 and you compare that to a reference year. It can either be 1920, that's the default comparison, or if you're not going to use 1920, then you compare it to 1819. Further on in the broadcast, folks, when I look at some numbers, I'll revisit that idea of when you can choose 1920 and when you can choose 1819. Now, if that turnover drop, and emphasize the word drop, by the way, there's got to be a decline in turnover. And if you're sitting at home thinking, what on earth do you mean by turnover, Mahmood? I'll explain that and show you on the next couple of slides. Just stick with me for a moment. Turnover, if it's dropped by more than 30%, then you will be entitled to the maximum grant, which can be as much as 7.5 grand. If your turnover drop is between 0 and 30%, then the maximum grant you'll be entitled to is £2,850. Now, the calculation for the level of the grant, by the way, it goes, if you manage to complete all the hurdles, you satisfy all the eligibility, you meet the criteria, you satisfy the turnover drop, then what it says is, look at your profits, take 80% of the average profits, multiply by 80% for a 3-month period, and bingo, that's how much you'll get as a one-off figure. It cannot exceed 7.5 grand. Now, the calculations for working out how much grant you will actually receive, by the way, the good news is you don't have to do that computation. HMRC will do the calculations for how much grant you actually get for you, because they've got your tax returns, they've got all your information. They are the one who are doing that final calculation to say how much grant you are entitled to. What you've got to do now, in addition, apart from saying to them on a checklist, yes, I satisfy all these other conditions, and yes, my turnover has dropped, they will expect you to feed in the numbers for the turnover and the turnover drop. That then tells them how much they are going to pay you. Now, I think it's worthwhile mentioning, folks, at this stage, what is it we mean by turnover? And just a little bit of terminology here. Now, just imagine you're in business. So if I take myself as an example, and during the year 2021, if I look at all the clients that I've provided work for, I'm going to give them invoices for my work that I've done, me and my team, what we've done. And if I add up all those invoice values during the course of the year, and it tots up to, say, let's say £50,000, that is the value of my turnover. It's not the same, by the way, as the profit I would have made. So after I've taken into account staffing costs, renting of an office, insurance, and all the like, what's left out of that 50,000, excluding VAT, will be the profit. We're not looking at the profitability, we're talking about turnover. I'm going to show you, before we finish the broadcast, by the way, that if you are the one who's got to figure out where those numbers are, whereabouts on the tax return, you can actually extract those figures. So remember, if you haven't completed your 1920 tax return, then basically you're not going to get anything. So you've got to have done that. So I'll show you on the tax returns where you can get those figures. If you can't find your tax returns for whatever reason, then you can look at your records, your spreadsheets, your accounting software, and again, I'll indicate to you where you can get that figure for turnover. So turnover is the value of what you sell your goods and services to an end client. Not the profit that you make, but the actual turnover, the value. We might call it sales as well, by the way, or revenue. Take your pick, but that's the number that we're looking at. Right, so I think it's time. We haven't quite finished. Let's drag in some numbers now, folks, to actually illustrate what we're talking about. Now, if this works, I'm just going to take this off the screen for a moment. I'm going to take that out, and I'm going to bring in, oh, what should we do first of all? I'll tell you what will be useful, folks. Let's have a figure out where we get these numbers from. So we're talking about turnover. Let me share my screen. Hopefully that's reasonably large enough. Let me just see if I can expand it a little bit more. Now, if you are a taxpayer, if you're completing this section, I think that's a very interesting shade of orange. Maybe orange was a little bit grandiose on my side. Obviously, colours aren't my best forte, but whatever colour you take that to be, this is what's called a short self-employed. So typically, if your turnover is below a certain level, typically 85,000 for a 12-month period, then you typically complete one of these forms here. It's 2 pages, and the bit that's relevant for you, if you come down here and if you look at box number 9, that's listed there, that's the figure that you're looking to take. Typically that figure would not include VAT. You're not including other income that you may have generated. Revenue are only interested in your trading income, so don't include things like rental income, which shouldn't be there anyway. Don't include things like pension income, which shouldn't be there anyway. But don't include things such as your self-employed grants. So if you've received a self-employed grant during the 2021 tax year, and most people, if they are eligible, would have claimed potentially 3 grants, that goes into the tax return, but that does not form part of your turnover for the year. It doesn't mean, by the way, that that self-employed grant escapes tax. HMRC will still take a slice of it, but for our purposes, the 5th grant do not include your self-employed grants that you've received during 2021. They are excluded. If you happen to be in a hospitality sector, you're a restaurateur running a cafe or a bar, there would have been a help out to eat grant provided during the 2021 tax year. There would have been other grants that potentially also might be taxable. Do not include those as part of your turnover. So basically, box 9 is where it is on the short pages. If I go to the other pages that you're likely to encounter, now this is effectively the same principle. So this is what a more detailed self-employed set of pages looks like. And again, if you come down the page, if you can see there, box 15 is on that sheet, that form. That's where you get the figure from if you're completing the larger level, larger number of self-employed pages. Now, I did say, by the way, partnerships are also included. So if you happen to be a partner in a partnership, surprisingly enough, then what you've got, let's see if I can find it, everything except, so that's, let's just stop sharing the screen. Talk amongst yourselves, that's short pages. I printed off these earlier, just like a typical Blue Peter thing. It doesn't always come up. And if I can't find it, you just have to, there it is, fantastic. So let's go back on the stream. So this is partnership pages. Now granted, this is the longer form. Again, the same principle applies. You can have a short set of partnership pages. A good bit of illustration there. Try saying that as a tongue twister. And if you look there in terms of box 3.29 towards the top, that's where you'll get your turnover figure from. Now, as a thing to bear in mind, by the way, before we look at some actual illustrations, is when HMRC asks you to do the turnover calculation, the turnover is from all your business activities. So if you happen to be a partner in a partnership, you also happen to have another self-employed business as a sole trader, then you must include all the turnover from all those business activities. So your self-employed turnover plus your share of the partnership turnover. And typically that will be determined by your partnership profit share. So if you've got a partnership for which you've got a 30% stake, you've also got a self-employed business, you take 30% of the partnership turnover, 100% of your self-employed turnover, and lump them together. Now, as is most usual, and it happens, if you happen to have multiple self-employed businesses, They could be quite diverse, and you keep separate self-employed pages. HMRC expects you to aggregate all those turnover activities. So it's not just the one business you've got to include, it's the turnover from all your self-employed activities. If it's from a limited company, by the way, keep that out of the equation. Now, what I want to conclude with, folks, is to look at some numbers, the illustration of how the grant is actually calculated, and this will cater for the vast majority of situations. Now, I'm happy to share this. If you feel that you'd like to grab a hold of this copy of this wonderfully looking design spreadsheet, then drop me a line in the comments box, and I'm happy to share that. You can either have it as an individual Excel file, or if you're a Google person, and I'm a mix of the two, then I can share this as a Google sheet for you. You probably want an individual copy, but let me know and I'll make it happen that you can get a copy. Now let's have a look at this situation here. So we've got 3 potential years that we're going to look at. So we're taking 2021 as our figure for turnover. Even if it's only been a short period of time, by the way, then you must include the turnover for that 2021 tax year. Now, HMRC say, by the way, you can choose turnover from the 1st of April up to and including the end of the tax year, 5th of April 21. Make sure the turnover does not include any grants. Make sure the turnover does not include any income which is not self-employed. Make sure you include also any turnover you've got from other self-employed activities, as well as any partnerships that you may have. Now, in this example, I've calculated that is £10,000. We now have to compare that to a base year or a reference year if you're going to use HMRC language. Now, there is a major exception, but for now, let's just stick with me. Let's assume I've got a business. I'm going to be looking to claim the 5th grant. I meet all the other eligibility criteria in terms of level of profits, the fact that I'm self-employed, the fact that I've submitted all my tax returns. Again, most of that will be met for you by HMRC. But remember also, I'm saying that my demand in my business has been affected adversely because of coronavirus, and I expect it to be adversely affected also between the 1st of May 21 and the end of September 21 as well. So assume all that has been ticked, complied with, then my turnover for 2021 is 10,000. Now here's the choice. The default position is to compare that turnover to what it would have looked to what last year's turnover was for 1920. Now, if it's a straight situation where it's considered a normal year, and we're going to have to dive in a bit deeper to talk about a normal year, then what I do, I compare my 10,000 to my 12,000. If you look here, by the power of magic, it's worked out that that turnover drop is 16.7%. And I've considered 1920 to be a normal year of activity. Now, I've got a turnover drop, tick box 1. It's less than 30%. So the maximum grant I will be entitled to is 2850. In your particular situation, HMRC will take your average profits, multiply it by 80%, and convert that to what 3 months equivalent is. It cannot exceed 2850. Now, let's say, for argument's sake, that I take 1920 and I say 1920 is what I consider a normal year. So it's fair enough to compare it to that. Let's say, for argument's sake, change that to 20,000. Let's say that's one was wrong way around, 5,000 there, sorry. Let's go that for 20,000. Never do live calculation. So in that situation, I've changed it around slightly. My turnover in 2021 is 5 grand. 1920 is 20 grand. There's a turnover drop of 75%. It's a normal year. That means I get a maximum grant entitlement of 7.5 grand. So it can't exceed that. Remember, your actual claim will be based on what your profits have been that HMRC are taking into account and crunching. Now, let's think about a situation where we said you don't think 1920 is not a normal reference year. Now, that could be because you've lost a major contract. 1920, you've suffered from long-term illness. Those could be 2 situations to say, actually, it's not fair to compare it to 1920. So in that case, if you don't consider 1920 to be a normal year, it's not a one that you can use for reference purposes, then what you'll see there, you'll ignore 1920 and you can go back to compare it to what 1819 looks like. So if 1920 is not a good normal reference year for you because of maybe long-term illness, you lost a major contract in the year, and you're not really taking that as a comparable period of time, then you can compare your turnover movement to the year 1819. And on that basis, as we can see, 1819 is 36,000. Let's make that, let's say £4,000. Make it 5 actually. So normally you wouldn't be entitled to anything on that figure. There's no turnover drop, but HMRC will allow you to go back and compare it to 1819, where we've had a more dramatic drop. We can see 86%. That's over the 30% plus. Remember, once your drop is over 30%, you can get the maximum level of grant. So that's one set of scenarios. Do we think 1920 is a normal year? If so, use that as your comparison to work out the drop. If you don't think 1920 is a normal year, then you go back and you compare it to 1819. But whatever circumstance it is, you've got to compare 2021 against either 1920 or 1819. 1819 if 1920 is not normal, 1920 if it is normal. A couple of other situations I think I want to explain to you. Now, let's assume, let's set that back. Go back to yes. At the moment, I've set it to yes and saying that 1920 is a good period of time. Now let's assume it happens to be that 1920, actually I've only got 4 months worth of profits brackets turnover recorded. It could be I've changed my accounting year, and because of the peculiarities of how the tax system works, there may be situations where your accounting period is not exactly 12 months. Again, a topic for another day perhaps, but let's say you've got a short period of time. Now what happens there is, HMRC say, you've got to make sure you're comparing 2021 as far as you can to a 12-month equivalent. So let's assume your period of time for 1920 is only 4 months, then there's a bit of jiggery-pokery, and you effectively, you work out what 8 months worth of turnover would have been in 1819, and you lump that with the 1920 of 4 months. So together, that gives you a 12-month activity. What we said there is, assuming it's a normal year, that's an 83% drop approximately, you get the maximum grant. If it's not a normal year, then obviously you compare it to 1819. So that's situation number 1 on the variant. If 1920 is not a full 12 months, it's less than 12 months. So basically it's a bit of pro-rating that's got to be done. Now let's assume also though, in 1920, you haven't got a 12-month set of accounts, it's much longer than that. And again, maybe a topic for another broadcast later on, where we can talk about how HMRC and your accountants figure out what profits go into your tax return. So you can have a long period of account. Typically that might be you started trading, you don't want to do one set of accounts, you can do a fuller set of accounts, and let's say that comes to say 15 months. Well, basically what HMRC will say is, we expect you to pro rata. Now obviously in the first situation, your pro rata to what 12 months equivalent would be. So HMRC do not expect you to work in days, take 12/15, that's £4,000. In that scenario, there's no turnover drop, therefore you wouldn't get anything. So let's go 2,000 there. Therefore you get a drop. So basically 12 months plus pro rata. Now there is one exception, and it's a major exception. Let me just take this off the screen. Now, up until grant number 4, if you were registering for self-employment in the year 1920, you were not allowed to claim a grant, which, you know, unfair, excluded hundreds of thousands of taxpayers from the scenario. Now, Rishi, I wouldn't say on my advice, because I did predict it, but eventually they allowed self-employed people who'd filed in 1920 to claim grant number 4. Now, if you started trading in 1920 and that's your first time and you haven't got an 1819, a 1718 or 1617 tax year to compare against because it's your first period, HMRC say that's cool. You don't have to do any turnover calculations. We will base your grant on what you've done in 2021 only. What that means is, and it's probably a perverse way of compensating people. So if you started in 1920 and you haven't got a reference year to compare against, there's no turnover calculation to do, and you will be entitled to the full grant. So just to reinforce that, start in 1920, you haven't got a previous reference year to look against, HMRC will allow you to claim the maximum grant. Okay, so that's potentially very good. There's no restriction, and if the profits figure it out and they work, you can get up to 7.5 grand, which is good news. Okay, folks, I hope you got some good value out of that short broadcast there as well. Check out the website, check out the YouTube channel. There's quite a bit of stuff written, not just on the 5th self-employed grant, but also other matters which are really critical that you guys need to tap into to help you on your way. Now, the last couple of things to mention: the doors close at the end of September 21, so you need to make your grant application by then. Secondly, I've heard some rubbish talked about the self-employed grant. You do not need to have submitted your tax return for 2021 to get the grant. HMRC will check it, but you don't actually physically need to submit the grant. I still think it's good housekeeping. It's good news to get your tax return in early, so you know what you've got to pay, but you don't need to submit it in order to get the grant. The last thing to remember is you do these things with what's called good intention. So if you've got a reasonable belief that things are going to be pretty poor, that your business will have suffered by the time you get to September 21, as long as you've got a reasonable basis, some degree of evidence to support that, make the claim. Now, caveat: if you are submitting your 2021 tax return, you may be also doing that early because you want to apply for a mortgage, you want to prove your earnings here. At the moment, HMRC are checking manually all the 2021 tax returns that go on, especially because people are not completing the tax returns correctly. They're not saying they've received a self-employed grant and they're putting the wrong figures in there. All the tax returns now are being pulled for self-employed people and being checked independently and manually by HMRC. What that means is, based on a conversation I had with an HMRC members today, it could be as late as October before all the checks are actually completed. So if you've got a return in, expect a delay. There is the provision to accelerate it, but again, a story for another day. Folks, listen, I hope you found that useful. Thank you for spending your time with me tonight. If you're coming on some replay, #replay, any questions, feel free to share them. Apart from that, folks, I'll see you.